Continuing the Treasure of the Magi, a study of modern Zoroastrianism by James Hope Moulton. We remember the problem of Orthodoxy and Reform. I think we're in section C, aren't we? We remember the problem that faced thinkers in the early church. They inherited the Old Testament, but they had not found the historical key for which opens all its serious difficulties. Well, don't take it literally and worship some random incarnation concept instead. Is that their idea of a key? So taught by Christianity to realize its moral problems as a very real stumbling block, they went off on two lines of escape which seemed to us equally impossible. Either with Marcion, they threw over the Old Testament, they threw out the Old Testament altogether, or with the Orthodox, they devised allegorical explanations, the absurdity of which makes us gasp. Well, they don't even take Jesus literally. Restoring the law. No. Don't treat me as a god. No. I don't want to take that literally. You know. And yet, it was minds as great as Origen's that devised them. Now let us remember that the educated Hindu is in a far worse difficulty of our same kind. He inherits a religious legacy from prehistoric ancestors, Dravidianized, and then superficially Aryanized, but piously preserved. The inherent conservation of religion, which is responsible for the sinister word superstition, that is, survival, has nowhere had so perfect a work as in India. The well-known case of Greece shows that a highly intellectual nation may conserve the veriest rubbish by the gradual change of the nursery into a temple. It's cast off toys into sacred things. All the keen Athenian humor did not protect grave citizens from participating in solemn farces like the trial of a stone or a knife for killing a man, and the ceremonial casting of the guilty thing into the sea. The Indian has a great mass of survivals, many of them again as in Athens, preserving the once naive but now obscene ritual of primitive man. Well, nowadays people like to blame the guns rather than the culture and the personal choices of the people involved in doing those things. He has inherited the conviction that all these things are bound up with religion, and that the wrath of heaven will fall on those who neglect or despise them. No wonder he accepts with avidity and relief that occult lore which promises to justify to modern culture that outworn and impossible inheritance. How deeply it is ingrained, it is beyond our utmost power to realize. Convinced and earnest Christian leaders with 3 or 4 generations of Christian conviction behind them have confessed to hold it still. Well, the more recent converts are more likely to have a direct idea, okay, what's part of the faith, what's not part of the faith. But Christianity, the Bible is a contradictory jumble at times, and all a Christian has to do is worship Jesus and they're a Christian, so it's a lot more common in Christianity. I mean, where do you think Christmas, Halloween, and Easter came from? The striking words of one of the foremost of them may be quoted from a private letter to illustrate a fact which no missionary should overlook. From Mr. K.T. Pauls, who was the General Secretary of the YMCA in India in 1917. Let me give you an illustration from my own experience. I am a Christian, and a Christian worker by choice, giving up government service for the purpose, and yet, from my railway carriage window, when I first caught a glimpse of the tower of the temple at Chidambaram, my heart gave a great leap. Strains of devotional poetry surged through my mind. If I were a Hindu, I should have fallen prostrate, right on the carriage floor, towards that tower, and worshipped in absolute devotion that shrine, which calls for such words of devotion all over the Tamil land. Now, facing a direction and prostrating, it's done for whatever you worship, but few people are going to actually worship a building. The poetry representing it had thrilled my being. Long years before, I had the sight of that sacred building. I do not know what you think of me when I have made this confession. I do not see how it is inconsistent and compromising for me to say this, and hold the conviction that Christ must and will dominate my country and my people. But such is not to be realized without recognizing the tremendous hold which our traditions and our sacred things have, and let me say rightly have on our minds and beings. This being so, we may be able to see why the Indian mind is not critical as ours when theosophy comes its way. The will to believe affects the most rationalist of thinkers, and those who imagine they look at all things in the driest of dry light. The absurdity of Mrs. Besant's clever nonsense will dawn on the educated Hindu some day, but we have no right to plume ourselves on superior sagacity because it does not appeal to us. There is no conceivable reason why it should. It solves the problem of ours. It offers no plausible excuse for keeping old toys, of which we are very fond, and yet ashamed, as adults must be. All the exposure and all the ridicule which theosophy has received seems to have left the Indian mind untouched. Before we condemn the Indian as destitute of logic, morality, and of humor, let us be sure that we realize how almost irresistible is the impulse which recommends this new apologetic for Hinduism, for popular Hinduism, unless attenuated by sacrificing all that is most characteristic, must be defended in this way or not at all. How much of this defense will serve the Parsi theosophist? Surely not its conclusion, for he has a religion, the nucleus of which needs no defense except exposition and faithful obedience. It is the Parsi departure from the Gathas that has given theosophy its chance. Parsi ceremonial has no immoralities to be excused, and few features which demand any violent revolt on the part of the educated. Well, can't the educated reason out convincing the greater change in society instead of the Marxist shock and awe sort of way of change? That it smacks strongly of the nursery is obvious in many places, a scheme which can veil absurdities behind scientific jargon and justify things hard to take seriously by suggestions of profound underlying doctrine, has very clear attractiveness. There is therefore the same sort of motive that which appeals to the cultured Hindu. The ritual is not as primitive. It has no claim whatever to the Zoroastrian paternity. It claims, and it is really, as the outsider can more easily see, not merely absent from the Gathas, but foreign to their spirit. But it is traditional, and the tradition is at least 2,000 years old. It has been with the Parsis during the whole of their Indian life, and the very question which make theosophy go down with the Indian make a strong appeal to the Parsi. For all his accessibility to Western ideas, he is an Indian and cherishes a popular pride in his rationality. When therefore a system comes to him which defends his immemorial ritual on lines that to his far from impartial mind seems plausible, he is not minded to be critical. But however easily we may find excuses for his misuse of science and his ready acceptance of Hindu doctrine, which are altogether foreign to Parsi theology, in any stage we cannot avoid an effort to appeal to his keen intelligence against accretions which are undermining all true Parsi orthodoxy. Let us take some of the points separately. We may mention, only to dismiss it, a movement called enlightenment, which is a thoroughgoing adaptation of theosophy, naked and unashamed. Mahatmas and all, great ones. Its prophet met great ones. Oh, I spoke too soon, right? A generation ago, in those conveniently near regions of Baluchistan, where, until the times do alter, the infinite inane may shelter safety from all perils of verification. They taught him wisdom too profound to express itself in the poor vocabulary of the English language. Well, living languages, perhaps they couldn't communicate it, but if English doesn't know something, it can come up with the words to add something. I mean, it can't communicate the style from one language to another, but But the fortunate inhabitants of Surat may hear his doctrine distilled as the dew in Gujarati, and even the darkness of Bombay is illuminated once a fortnight for the faithful 60 or so who care to come. We mention this for completeness' sake, and because the phenomenon is not without significance, as a reductio ad absurdum, since theosophy, despite all its brave attempts to pass itself off as an eclectic system, as in India, nothing but an interpretation of Hinduism, we are not surprised to find its influence on Parsi doctrine, exerted very largely to introduce Hindu ideas. The merit of celibacy is perhaps the most astonishing of its innovations. We have already seen that asceticism is foreign to early or latter Zoroastrianism, and celibacy absolutely defiant of it. There is room in the Christian system for a special call, which is served by the foregoing of family ties, witness Paul himself and many a modern missionary. But Parsi scriptures of all dates repudiate the very thought of it fiercely. Theosophy, which has the faculty of creation ex nihilo, and can make two and two come to what it pleases, juggles with the ancient faith, and inserts and cuts out knots, whatever it will. And Parsis who obey this new regulation for attaining spiritual heights are called Orthodox. It is strange. Well, Orthodox is usually a latter version rather than the fundamentalists. The fundamentalists try to look at the source and try to follow it for themselves. Asceticism takes a much more harmless form when it proceeds to forbid animal food, or, of course, under an impulse derived from Indian religions. Here again, Christianity would be less uncompromising than in ancient Zoroastrian scriptures. Now, Christianity actually forbids vegetarianism. I'm not talking about Jesus. I'm talking about Paul. Remember Paul's emphatic declaration that if he found flesh-eating proved a snare to his brother, he would never touch meat again. The plea of kindness to animals naturally appeals to the higher instincts which the gospel fosters, and yet there is a mistaken shifting of emphasis all too visible when working of the rule of ahimsa is studied. Cruelty to living creatures is practiced by multitudes in India who would shrink in horror from putting the maimed beast out of its misery. The life of man, moreover, matters far less than that of lower animals, as we see when the Jane sets free plague rats from traps. Against this stands the well-known and most prominent Magian law as to the merit of killing noxious animals. Well, in your own home. It was a central feature of the system to set aside, which, as the Indianized theosophist does, is rather drastic orthodoxy. Well, so-called orthodoxy, so-called orthopraxy, right belief, right practice. So-called is not always quite fully on it. It tends to be partially. Significantly, the conservative tradition is, but definitely differs in parts. It would matter less if the Parsi innovator frankly canceled this rule and the indisputable practice of Parsi antiquity sanctioning the eating of meat, declaring that new and higher light had come, but it is to feed dogma that inspiration ceased long ago, and the text of ancient scriptures must therefore be understood according to occult principles which put the mere philologist in his proper place. Now, not quite, because if God has stopped sending messenger prophets, much more exemplar prophets, that doesn't mean that everybody can't look at it, pick up a scripture and say, okay, what does this mean? Rather than the conservative example, what does this mean for any situation in life? And this one you can find reference to anything, big or small in some way or another. And other ones, maybe there's some gaps. I've certainly shown that in my Like the Goetia work with the Bible, but there's certainly some subjects that it really doesn't talk about. And some things in the Bible or other things are very specifically for a time and place, but my stomach rumbles and this mention of food, If the Vendidad lays it down that animals created by Ahriman are to be destroyed as a work of piety, occult science has its own easy rubric. The doctrine of the esoteric meaning of ancient scripture is conveniently applicable all around. Every prophecy of scripture is a private interpretation belonging to the adepts alone. It seems that the last Parsi adept died 3 centuries ago, so that it must be left to the occultists to rediscover the lost key. In addition to promising this, the Theosophist assures the trustful Parsi that the lost Nasks of the Avesta are in safekeeping, of course, in Tibet, and will appear one day. Clairvoyants can always meanwhile promise to read them. To refute all this by facts and arguments is made impossible by the very range of the assertions. These things are spiritually discerned, and outsiders can no more understand these mysteries than an African savage can understand a Marconi apparatus. And we find that the European is far more savage than the tribes of various countries were, but that's what these people think. There's no surprise. This was written, a century ago when the Ku Klux Klan was at its worst. So, and things were stirring up. Things were starting to face a direction in Germany and other parts of Europe, and yeah. The only answer is for a demand for credentials, and when we remember the record of fraud with which the Society opened its history and scanned the career of Europe and American successors, who have so worthily carried on the adventurous Blavatsky's traditions, we can easily understand why honest seekers after truth generally hold aloof. But what an irony it is that in days when Western importations are suspect per se, the East should attend to prophets who, for the best of reason, are not honored in their own country. Well, you can, through certain signs, basically refute the idea that, well, I don't know about that, but I know you've said stuff that's not true, claiming prophetic authority, so you're either a false prophet or the beings you're speaking to are liars, and I just need to go elsewhere because I can't afford to be tricked by, something serious I could fall for, With this fact in mind, we can proceed to consider the modifications of Zoroastrian doctrine which owe their impulse to the Theosophic method and are pursued independently of the Adyar factory. Some of the most deservedly respected Parsis interpret their ancient religion in terms of this essentially Hindu method and declare that it has done much to deliver their people from materialism. In the light of that claim, we may try to show what has happened to some of the leading doctrines of the community under this dispensation. Its general influence is curiously diverse in its operation. On one side, it acts in a latitudinarian direction. Outwards compliance with ritual practice goes with private neglect, justified by the claim to have reached a plane of religious experience in which things are no longer needed. On the other, we have esoteric lore tacked on to the ritual, which gains a new lease of life by a series of explanations that would have greatly puzzled the composers of the Vendidad. First, we may mention the application which has the most plausible grounds for affiliating itself to Magian theology. Now, it's apparent that Scripture can have multiple meanings. In its original, the literal meaning obviously was meant, but that doesn't mean there's not other use and such. But don't do this just in an unguided way. Don't do this to cause divisions. The modern justification for the use of prayers in a dead and unknown language is an adaptation of the doctrine of mantra, or spell. The notion that words have mystic efficacy quite apart from their meaning is an inheritance from primitive religion and is worldwide. Well, it's not necessarily that they're worshiping the words, it's an arrangement that is important to get right, just like saying the creed right. It's not so ritualistic once you get into it. But if you just observe or get through it, then there's some issue. But it's more of a belief thing than a form thing. Zarathustra himself was not ignorant of it, but with his deep religious instinct set it aside. A greater even than Zarathustra condemned unintelligible words in prayer, which expects to be heard from sheer volubility. Matthew 6:7. Is it Patialogine, or is it Bapalogine? The printing's kind of smudged a little bit, so it's kind of spread. I think it's supposed to be a P. Appears to mean gabble, the use of words for word's sake, depending on the mere quantity for that efficacy. See the verb discussed in Moulton and Milligan. Okay. Theosophy, which is prepared to find high, modern-sounding justification for every survival from the nursery of religion, tells us gravely that the sacred words produce potent vibrations, even if the right note be once caught. One might cause a suspension bridge to quiver with a violin. Without tarrying to examine the violin question, we might quote Dr. Dalla's summary. And again, that's a very clear thing that we have, is that music has its effect. So the style of the original language, it's not that the meaning can't be translated. It's so, presuming that everybody who uses the original language is doing something other than preserving their tradition, looking at the actual revelation for itself. The syllables composed in the Avestan text, they aver, are so mysteriously adjusted to each other in the prayers that they produce vibrations on the ethereal plane. When pronounced, the potency of such rhythmical sound is so great that every good thought that flashes out with strong occult force and sounds forth a good elemental, it creates forms in the ethereal world, attracts good elementals, and repels evil ones. Every single sentence conveys an occult meaning, and the prayers composed in the celestial tongue of the prophet and other seers have an unmistakable efficacy, conducing to the welfare of the individual concerned. But their renderings into any modern vernacular would make them totally ineffectual as prayers. Well, that's not quite true, but such a concept of prayer is obviously as far from Zarathustra as the cotton rags that float from the prayer masts at the top of the sacred hill at Darjeeling are from Buddha. It may be added that the sounds which have this occult potency are not even the words of the original Gathas, but a modern and unrecognizable mispronunciation. Thus, the Honover begins. Athau Varyo Thara Tose Sade Chide Chavan Gois Desda Menengo, to chant the original. Yatahu Varyo Atharatush Ashat Chit Hacha Vangeush Dazdamanango would apparently leave the ethereal plane unresponsive. Well, if they have the intention, even the intention has its spiritual connection, doesn't it? The use of modern scientific terminology is a strong point with these ingenious defenders of survivals. An able and high-minded scholar discovers a primitive purpose to create pyroelectricity in a part of the ritual. There can be no other meaning in the officiating divine touching the edge of the fire altar with the fire spoon after having established contact with the other priest or priests by holding one another's hands, and also in his touching with that spoon so charged that vessels containing the consecrated things, even though the principle may have been forgotten now, the practice clearly points to a thermo-electrization. Arpatastan and Nirangastan was translated by S.J. Bulsara, M.A., Bombay, 1950. It does not seem possible to convince really serious men like this that they're confounding the two great categories of material and spiritual on which Zarathustra laid such stress. If evil can be destroyed by a thermoelectric current, evil is purely material, and the measures we take against it are all of the same order as our putting disinfectants down an offensive drain. Spirituality has small chance of surviving long the enthronement of such a method. How far physical science will respond to this touching confidence we must leave to the experts to determine. Western doctors have probably not examined the beneficial effects of thermoelectric current communicated to a ring of expectants, linked as for Auld Lang Syne, and attached to a poker held on the hob of the fire. It is hoped that after this hint they will give so promising a therapeutic method the attention it deserves. The same order of thought belongs to the theosophist justification of the periodic isolation of women. The latter Avestan concept of the Varna, or kingly glory, is violently interpreted as something attached to every individual, and as nothing else than the magnetic aura which, as we doubtless know, surrounds us all. Those who have developed their inherent clairvoyant powers can see other people's aura and discern their spiritual state. Now, light, heat, and magnetism, you can get yourself into state. You can focus on contrasting colors to help you see it. You can vibrate certain parts to help you see these auras. But, you can't make the moral judgments on things. You may be able to determine moods, and people are like, ooh, love, hope, fear, and hate, whatever emotions other than that you were attaching to these motivations for life. Let's not judge them in that state. They all have their value. Those who have developed their inherent clairvoyant powers can see other people's aura and discern their spiritual state, supposedly. It seems that women in these isolation times have their aura spiritually diseased, so that if they leave their seclusion, even to see a husband or child that is dead, they will impart contagion. It does not appear that the inventors of this eminently scientific doctrine, from whose earnest Parsees have borrowed it to uphold a hard-pressed tradition, teach that lying or fraud or immorality affect the sinner's aura. No clairvoyant seems to have detected anything wrong with the aura of HPB. You know, you know who I'm talking about. Are those of latter impostors. I've read Blavatsky's work, I think. Doesn't she only write a few really big volumes or something? Theosophy is essentially non-moral and is not interested in mere questions of right and wrong, or is sort of relativistic in terms of the spiritual truths too. The Theosophic transformation of Zoroastrianism includes the adaptation of an ancient heresy which was incorporated in Mithraism. Mithraism, yeah. The exaltation of Zervan Akarana, boundless time, as the supreme deity from whom Ormazd and Ahriman emanated. And as we saw previously in this book, that it's not that they believe, the original idea was that this was either humans' choice between good and evil, truth and ignorance, or it was the angel and the demon that led the charge. The use of this shadowy conception, stoutly repudiated by the Orthodoxy of the Sassanian age, and of course altogether foreign to the Gathas, enables the Theosophists to force upon Parsi religion the alien notion of an impersonal divinity, a featureless neuter of which nothing can be predicted. This is easily recognized as the Brahma of philosophic Hinduism, and we may leave it to the philosophers and to the students of Hinduism itself. Here is enough to say that this denial of personality to the One and the idea of men of being merged into this universal absolute is wholly foreign to the Zoroastrian religious doctrine, as Dr. Dalla well puts it. This doctrine is certainly not Zoroastrian because through the whole history of the